Wonderful. Hello, everybody. So my name is Anastasia Felker, and I'm one of the 3 co-organizers of the PoSoCoMeS seminar series, and I would like to welcome everyone at our 9th session of the seminar series. PoSoCoMeS is the working group at the Memory Studies Association, and this working group is devoted to post-socialist and comparative memory studies. Now, with the seminar series, we discuss recent books and ongoing research in our field. And before we start the seminar, I would like to use this opportunity to draw the audience attention to the fact that PoSoCoMeS right now is collecting information about fellowships and other resources for scholars from Ukraine and others who are affected by the war, and especially those fleeing persecution in Russia or Belarus. So in case you know scholars in danger, please do contact us. And also, in case you're aware of opportunities and possibilities for those affected by the war, please also contact anybody at PoSoCoMeS or one of the organizers at this seminar series. And now I would like us to start the seminar, and today we are discussing the book Repression, Resistance and Collaboration in Stalinist Romania, 1944-64, Post-Communist Remembering. This is a book authored by Ciobanu, and at this roundtable, the author and the 3 discussants will emphasize the significance of the study, the post-communist and memory studies through the lenses of the disciplines that every discussant represents, and Roland Clark, historian, Joanna Wawrzyniak is a historical sociologist, and Ciobanu and Mihai-Stelian Rusu are sociologists. And I give the floor to the author. Yeah?
Thank you, Anastasia. I realized this presentation may not come at the right time. I know that this working group is very much involved in the current situation, the current tragedy that is occurring right now in Europe, in Ukraine. So thank you very much for still being able to organize and host this event. Also, many thanks to the 3 panelists. I know Joanna is extremely busy. She's away and she has many presentations. Many thanks to Roland. I know, Roland, you've been involved in another book panel yesterday. Roland is the president of the Society for Romanian Studies, so I think he is just overworked and overburdened.
And that's all I do these days.
With so many commitments. And thank you to Mihai also for taking time to attend this event. I have to say that probably my mind hasn't really been on my work and on my book in the past 2 weeks. Although I live in the United States, I've been very emotionally and politically involved in what is happening right now in Europe. And perhaps on a smaller scale, I'm also trying to do something here in Plattsburgh, which my university that is part of the larger system of State University of New York, at least trying to raise awareness and make people understand why is this happening, and how much I know about the realities of the grounds that are not necessarily reflected in the American media. I collect my information from people like you who are in Europe. Also, it is kind of very sad because I was looking at my book yesterday and the day before yesterday, and especially something caught my eye, something that I mentioned in the conclusion. Among other things, I was pointing out at how historical revisionism used by non-academic actors can have potential destructive consequences and impact on societies, on countries that share similar borders, and also on the future of the European Union and democracy in general. So I was mostly referring because my book was published in 2020, but my analysis kind of ends somewhere in 2019. So I was, of course, looking at the Romanian case. This is a book about Romania. Romania is a case study in historical memory. But I was making some references to democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland, to Brexit, and also to the annexation of Crimea. So at the time, I don't think that any of us thought that historical revisionism can lead to such civilian destruction and human rights violations. So this is something that I didn't discover. It has been argued before me by very well-known scholars of memory studies, historians, social scientists, and civic activists. So before I start presenting the argument and the framework of my monograph, I would like to say a few words of how I got here, why I chose this topic, and to explain the title a little bit. Although it seems that we are kind of a Romanian/Polish group, right? So I assume most of us, I know my Romanian colleagues and colleagues who work in Romanian studies have good knowledge of Romanian history. My career actually started as I started as a student of democratization in East and Central Europe. So I was looking at the Romanian case compared to other cases in the region, trying to understand how the communist regime, how the December 1989 revolution impacted the very slow and rather contradictory path to democratization in Romania. But then later, I understood more and more that memory politics has a lot to do with processes of Europeanization, democratization. And I mostly looked for a few years at official policies, official memory policies. But in the course of my work, I realized that in order to understand all of these things, I have to look at more grassroots levels of historical remembrance and memory processes, especially since the 1990s, but up to now, if you go to Romania, if you go to the main bookstores in Bucharest, but in other cities, you see so many memoirs, so many oral histories that feature the lived experiences of political prisoners who've been victimized and repressed during the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, in communist Romania. So mostly this particular stage of Romanian communism, which is labeled as the Stalinist type, Gulag type of repression, seem to be over present in Romanian public spaces and in intellectual, academic, and public debates in Romania. Then the title of the book, I was asked by younger colleagues, why 1944 to 1964? Why do I chronologically situate this history so late, right? Well, this is because unlike other countries in the region, Romania never really experienced a genuine de-Stalinization. It is true that in 1958, there has been a change at the higher echelons of the Romanian communist parties. The so-called Romanian faction succeeded in marginalizing other leaders who were part of minority groups, ethnic groups in Romania. But this really meant an inner power struggle and an attempt to fake some kind of liberalization of the communist regime in Romania. In reality, Romania was very late in breaking up with this generalized repression. Only in 1964, the last prisoners were released. And only in 1962, the collectivization of agriculture ended in Romania. So this is why we have this title that includes 1944 to 1964. So 1944 is also the beginning of the communization process in Romania. And I'm not a historian. Roland Clark, who is a historian, perhaps could clarify these things later. Now, what is that I've been trying to argue and show in my monograph? I've been trying to look at how these processes of remembering the Stalinist repression in Romania have shifted from individual, group, and family representations of lived or witnessed experiences, characteristics of the 1990s throughout mid-2000s, have shifted to more recent state sponsors expressions of historical remembrance, and how these images, representations have been incorporated in official commemorations, propaganda sites, and some rather symbolic restorative and compensatory measures. So this significant transformation in the memorialization of the Stalinist era seems to indicate its integration into a much broader and larger narrative, master narrative of national trauma, or to cite the well-known distinction used by Jan Assmann, it suggests the transformation of autobiographical or generational memory, the so-called communicative memory, into mediated and remembered history, cultural memory. So I utilize a kind of the bottom-up approach to my study. So I look at three distinctive levels of representation of this repression and in victimization in the Gulag as expressed by three distinctive actors. So the first level refers to the victims themselves and their descendants, who produced first-hand accounts and testimonies of their lived experience. A second intermediary level connects individual and group actors with state actors through civil society organizations in the development of this historical remembrance and collective narrative construction. So it was until 2000s, maybe mid-2000s, that civil society actors reinterpreted and re-expressed such experiences from the perspective of an anti-communist, post-communist rhetoric. So it is important to emphasize that this began to unfold in the aftermath of the December 1989 revolution. And unlike other countries in the region, the communist regime in Romania was overthrown through an abrupt, violent, and bloody popular uprising. And when I discuss civil society actors, I label them as both interpretive elites, meaning journalists, novelists, playwriters, filmmakers, artists, who actually understood the transformative potential of first-hand accounts, and by using powerful symbolism through sound and images, managed to project an image of the Gulag that generated empathy and also identification with the victims among certain segments of the public. But also part of the civil society, we had former dissidents, public intellectuals, some segments of the clergy. Of course, an instrumental role was assumed by the association of the former victims, former prisoners of the communist regime, and also the historical parties that re-emerged after December 1989. And there has always been a great overlap between the members of these historical parties, especially their leaders, the National Liberal Party, but most importantly, the National Peasant Party that restyled itself as the National Peasant Christian Democratic Party. Their leaders, mostly older people, former political prisoners, also involved with victims associations. So due to the work of these actors, the Stalinist communists became to be understood as part and parcel of a political rhetoric that sustains a kind of a patriotic, heroic version of the history of communism. So finally, this narrative was most recently appropriated by state actors, and they expressed this in official ceremonies and in certain measures and symbolic gestures of historical redress. In parallel, we have a new kind, not so new actually, civil society that emerged since 2000, represented by right-wing, some extremist, highly religious civic groups that attempted to a certain extent successful to amplify this political message and to take it to extreme forms of public representation that have resurfaced and reawakened very deep-seated tensions between one set of memories, between the victims and descendants of the victims and the memory activists of the Jewish Holocaust in Romania, and those who try to revive certain myths that are associated with the Romanian fascism, the myth of Antonescu, Hitler's ally during World War II in Romania, and also the revival of the legionary ideology, kind of native fascist ideology appropriated and disseminated during the interwar period by the Iron Guard movement. So when I analyze these three levels of historical remembrance, I look at issues of individual, group, social identity and affirmation, recognition and representation. So I look at how various channels and processes through which memory as an individual and social act becomes intergenerationally transmitted and then subsequently embedded in a comprehensive discourse of a community through ritualized and performative acts of historical remembrance. And very few, I will try not to be too detailed about the three levels and how I analyze these three levels and some of my findings. As far as the first level of individualized accounts of lived experience, I utilized a kind of interpretive approach of the memoirs of former political prisoners. And there are two things that are very important here. First, to take into account the context in which these first-hand accounts have been written. It was in the aftermath of the December '89, when anti-communist opposition was very weak and under threat by the successors of the Romanian Communist Party. And so the victims of this repression understood very well the transformative potential and the symbolic, the powerful symbolism of their lived experiences by pointing out in their memoirs at the danger of a communist restoration in Romania. Also, a very careful examination of these narratives illustrate very deep ambiguities and tensions among these actors in the way in which they try to reconstruct this traumatic experience of imprisonment, and how can they rebuild a coherent sense of self. So narratives go back and forth between conflicting attitudes and themes. At one extreme, we have stories of resistance, altruism, heroism, honesty, dignity, solidarity among political prisoners. On the other hand, we have the opposite, which is weakness, cowardice, betrayal, selfishness, so a lot of moral ambiguity. And I think some of these conflicting memories have been illustrated by very interesting titles of these memoirs, things like Blessed You Be Prison, the horrors and the charms of the detentions. So these are just some examples that illustrate these ambiguities. But in my 6 chapters of the book, I try to analyze these first-hand accounts by looking at distinctive, specific socio-demographic characteristics of former political prisoners, different groups in terms of age, gender, political affiliation, social origin, religious affiliation. I look also at different generations. I make the distinction between political prisoners who were imprisoned in 1948 or even before, as it was the case of former legionaries who have a history of imprisonment since 1930s, first by King Carol II, who had a short-lived royal dictatorship, then under Antonescu. Then the 1956 generation, the younger students who were imprisoned because their real or imaginary connection with the Hungarians who protested against the communist regime in 1956. I look at members of historical parties. I also look at the lived experiences of the partisans who made up the armed resistance, various groups that clandestinely resisted the Sovietization and communization of the country in the mountains regions. I look at women, so I look at gender representations of these lived experiences, but I also look at the perpetrators. And yes, it is true, we have much less first-hand accounts of prison guards, prison officials, some former officials who held important positions in the state party. However, there have been enough of them that allowed me to analyze these memoirs. So there is a fragmented memory. There is no unified voice about this repression. So there are some serious distinctions, and maybe we'll get to discuss this later. But all these have something in common, which is the quest for historical redress and for justice. Now, at the second level, the civil society activism. So this is, we are talking a very militant civil society, but also rather chaotic and not very coherent civil society as far as their strategy of bringing real, genuine transitional justice. in the first decade of the democratic transition in post-communist Romania. So, and what is interesting is that we have some interesting bedfellows here. We have the so-called dissidents, or people who claim to be part of the so-called resistance through culture in Romania in the 1980s, and formal political prisoners, and also other associations that emerged in response to the aftermath of December '89, the Civic Alliance and the Timișoara Society, who are trying to promote an anti-communist rhetoric in the public space. So, but all of these actors have been very vocal in exposing the crimes of Stalinism, demanding justice for the victims, and leading efforts to initiate transitional justice measures. But less so was discussed about late communism and Ceausescu's regime. So these actors managed to manufacture a historical narrative that described communism in general, not just early communism, as a generalized collective disaster imposed by the population by an atheistic foreign alien power. Foreign to the Romanian people, who are Christian, who are Orthodox. So the most coherent and prolific in this undertaking, there has been the Civic Academy Foundation, which set up the memorial of the victims of communism and the resistance in Sighet, and also journalist Lucia Hosu-Longin, who produced the video collection known as The Memorial of Pain, a history not learned in school, that was released in 2007. So there are many others, some of them localized, some of them produced by the descendants of the former victims. And what all of these have in common is these representations or performances, whether they are exhibitions or films or plays, or religious representations or reenactments, is a combination of religious symbolism and very romantic literary style. So it seems that individual and group trauma is translated into sacrifice, which then is presented as a defining characteristic of the whole group. And eventually there was this image that led to the condemnation of the communist regime in December 2006 in Romania, when the final report of the so-called Presidential Commission for the Analysis of the Romanian Dictatorship was released and endorsed by the president at the time, President Traian Băsescu, that labeled the communist regime in Romania and as illegal, criminal, and illegitimate. So it's important to note that this report was released to coincide with the country's accession into the European Union. And a lot has been written about this report. It has been very controversial at the time. So I assume most of you kind of are very familiar with the main criticisms of this report. What I want to emphasize here is how this report, how the outcome of this presidential commission that lacked subpoena power and led to rather mixed and meager results in the areas of lustration, restitution for the victims, and accountability, had a very strong impact on what I called delayed transitional justice and post-memory generation in Romania, which is the third level of my analysis. So this report mostly had better results in the area of truth-telling, if we talk about archives. but also impacted the way in which the radicalism of the anti-communist civil society has been replaced by what I called defensive anti-communism of various governments and officials in the last decade in Romania. So it's interesting how this has been appropriated by successors of the former Communist Party that wanted to actually re-legitimize the post-communist state by appropriating this narrative and not to engage in genuine transitional justice policies, which is a iffy thing in itself, because we are so far away from the 1950s repression, even from December '89 revolution, and from the communist regime in general. So, however, in 2014, it was for the first time that a special government agency that included the victims of communism have been added with the already existent special government agency that promoted the interests of the victims of the December '89 revolution. A huge monument was unveiled in Bucharest, dedicated to former political prisoners, and 2 criminal trials resulted in convictions against 2 former prison commandants for crimes against humanity. What is interesting to me is that whether it is during the trials of these former officials or during public ceremonies, communism is always described by judges, prosecutors, elected politicians, journalists, historians as a criminal regime. So it is perceived and presented again as an alien political system, which had not only victimized certain segments of the population, but has deprived the whole country of a normal historical development and delayed the full transition to democracy over the last 2.5, 3 decades. So it is true that specific references are primarily made in official discourse to events and individuals linked to early communism, so before 1964, but also historical continuities with the violent events of December 1989 are certainly recognized. So now the Stalinist-style repression and the December revolution have been merged in a common historical narrative that emphasizes collective trauma, but also acknowledges the necessity of confronting and ultimately overcoming the reality of what has been allegedly an externally imposed regime. What is mostly interesting but equally distressing is that old themes that dominated the 1980s official propaganda of the nationalist communist regime during Nicolae Ceausescu's dictatorship, such as ethnic nationalism, national victimization and suffering, the myth of an exceptional nation, of an exceptional historical destiny, the primacy of the Romanian culture over Western culture, and not so much during communism, but although in some subtle forms too, this theme of a Christian Orthodox heroism, all of these themes have been resurfaced. So we have both the trauma of the Gulag and the heroic episodes of resistance that became part of a canon of remembering that sustains a culture of national identity described by and invoking victimization, exemplary figures, and Christian sacrifice. So certain religious and mnemonic practices and forms of representation encouraged by the Orthodox Church aspire to confer sacred status upon some victims of the Stalinist repression, and in some cases on those whose alleged affiliation to extremist right-wing movements or ideologies were already well known, but are either denied or minimized or trivialized by the proponents of the so-called prison saints movement and other actors. And I'm not going to go into details with this. I think many people who are in the audience know a bit of detail about the prison saints movement. Now, what are the lessons that can be learned from the Romanian case? About Romania, about the region, and more broadly about issues of historical memory and remembrance. So the first lesson I would say has to do with the passage of the time and generational change. So we are more than 3 decades after the collapse of the communist regime, and maybe as much as 3 generations away from this Stalinist Gulag repression. So we see it is very interesting to look at how society redefines and accepts the term of retroactive justice, how it becomes easier for larger groups, segments of the society to accept claims of victimhood related to a past to whom they don't have any kind of direct relationship. So, of course, in the aftermath of December 1989, it was extremely problematic for former officials, even for the general public, people who were just bystanders or simply acquiesced to the communist regime, to accept these types of claims. This generational shift also affected and unified the descendants of the victims. It's important to note here, for those of you who are not aware, that although I mentioned the Association of Former Political Prisoners as the main association that engaged in militant civil society, anti-communist activists, that the victims are also very divided. So we had an association that brought together former legionaries who felt they were not accepted by other political prisoners, and also they were excluded from the meager but the very few compensatory measures. We also had the victims of the so-called deportees from the Baragan region, the western part of the country, who were deported later for the alleged crime of Titoism, for being sympathetic to Tito's regime. And when I met one of the leaders of this group in Timișoara, and I asked him, why didn't you become part of the Association of Former Political Prisoners? He told me that they didn't think that their suffering was as significant. So they felt that they have to organize in a different association. So if 30 years ago, there were maybe as many as 40,000 former political prisoners or deportees who were alive, this number shrank significantly. I'm not even sure if there are 2,000 of them. Many of them are actually more descendants of these victims. So it became logical for them to speak with a unified voice. So the passage of the time also is related to the second lesson, that has to do with myth making, which is widespread kind of phenomenon in the region, post-Soviet space, post-socialist state, the Balkans, the Baltics, Central Asia. But as I will try to show, myth making has also something to do with the passage of the time. So in December 1989, an ideological vacuum, not only a political vacuum, resulted from the overthrow of the communist regime. And both on the right and on the left, political parties, other actors had a very difficult time in manufacturing coherent ideological value systems, ideas, and beliefs. So in these circumstances, two competing myths emerged. One that was promoted by the National Salvation Front and its heirs, the provisional body that took the task of managing the country after Ceausescu's execution, that eventually became a political party and resorted to some of the old methods of the communist regime to stay in power. So because the communist regime was associated with Ceausescu's dictatorship, with repression, with economy of shortages, they adopted the myth of December 1989 as the turning point, the break-up point with the regime that was undertaken by the whole country, by the whole nation. So kind of a collective rebellion and heroic overthrow of the communist regime. And then the second myth promoted by the historical parties and civil society that looked at the interwar historical period as a model, an alternative for the post-communist society and for the post-communist political establishment. Now, these two competing myths are less relevant today, also because the National Peasant Party, that was the main political actor sustaining and disseminating this myth, disappeared from the political stage in the 2000 elections. We still have, it's true, the National Liberal Party, but their position is rather controversial. Also various alliances that they formed with the PSD, the Social Democratic Party. So the political landscape is different. The PSD actually dominates Romanian politics right now. The PSD also experienced a generational change. So they have a new generation of cadres who very conveniently embraced the rhetoric of victimization, foreign repression, heroism of the Romanian people, of the political prisoners, and merged it with the myth of the December 1989 revolution. So during these processes, various agents, memory agents, engaged in oversimplifications, overuses, and misuses of historical memories, and created an extremely essentialized, ethnocentric, exclusive type of historical narrative that does not promote a more inclusive, transnational, liberal type of historical memory or historical narrative. And this is, of course, not unique to Romania. We see that under the mantle of Europeanization and liberal democracy, these societies which I describe them as traumatogenic societies, were not really able to overcome not just the communist past, but multiple pasts. The pre-war past, World War II, and even more distant pasts, 19th century, early 20th century pasts. What the problem, I think, is that these societies went through such large-scale transformations, not only inflicted on the political systems, economies, but also at the level of collective sentiments and collective attitudes, that these societies are so prone to myth-making, to historical manipulation, that could easily be brainwashed into adopting ethnocentric, essentialized versions of the past that are conducive to inter-ethnic, inter-religious, interstate tensions, and even wars as we see today. So I hope I was able to keep up with the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica Ciobanu, for explaining the background of your book and for providing this insights from your empirical and theoretical work in this interesting Romanian case. I have in my home library a book by Eva Philipp. Eva Philipp is a mother of a very good friend of mine. She's also from Romania, and the title is Nicht schweigen, so do not be silent. It is also about Romanian Gulag, and it's a great example of oral history. So it was very interesting to hear some findings from academic work. And now I will give the floor to Roland Clark. Roland Clark is specialist in the history of East Central Europe and especially of Romania in the university at the University of Liverpool. And Roland Clark will show how Monica Ciobanu extends Jan Assmann's work on the development of cultural memory we heard in the beginning, as well as interrogating the relationship between memory and identity in post-socialist Romania. So Roland Clark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daria. And thank you, Monica, for going through your book so clearly. It's a really, really interesting book because it unpacks some exciting history, the sort of stuff that I like, and then explains why it matters and how it shapes contemporary Romania and the debates that are going on still today. I wanted to make one really simple point, and I'm going to make that repeatedly for the next 5 or 6 minutes, which is that what Monica's book does is it's focusing specifically on transitional justice, on transitions, and therefore almost all the arguments that she makes about the 1990s and the early 2000s can be applied to the 1940s as well. The way that Monica's book looks at it is, let's look at the events from the 1940s and see how that memory was dealt with in the 1990s. But if you put yourself back in the 40s and 50s, you can say, let's look at what was happening in the 1920s and 30s and how that memory is dealt with in the 40s and 50s. Because the events that are being remembered are themselves attempts to replace memory. What Jan Assmann's working on is this idea of how do you tank stuff that people really remember, autobiographical memory, and you make it something that they're supposed to remember. That's, culturally accepted communal cultural memory. And this is a huge problem that this Romanian Communist Party had in the 1940s and 50s. And almost all of the repression and violence that Monica talks about in her book is an attempt to wipe out the autobiographical memory in order to replace it with a new sort of cultural memory. So let me elaborate on that a little bit. She starts off talking about Pitești, this horrific experiment in re-education where they take people who were affiliated with the Legion of the Archangel Michael, with the Iron Guard, this fascist movement, and they torture them until they went out of their minds. Some of them died. But the idea was to take what you thought you remember and prove to you that actually you don't remember that. And it's interesting when you look at the guys who are being tortured, many of them were not legionaries or fascists in the 1920s and 30s when fascism was quite strong because they're too young. They embraced fascism during the 1940s as an anti-communist sort of thing, or else they encountered it maybe as high school kids in 1940 during the regime. And so most of the people in Pitești never knew Condemnation. They were never part of the fascist movement in the 30s. And they themselves, when they embrace fascism, they're embracing a memory of fascism and a particular type of fascism that's been sold to them through books or through their elders. So if you encounter the Iron Guard, for example, in the Blood Brotherhoods, the Frate de Cruce in the 1940s, as a high school student, you're not engaging with it as a violent anti-Semitic movement the way it was in the late 20s and 30s. You're engaging with it as something that your teachers are telling you, an ideal type movement with an ideology of let's all be good kids and be good people. And then they're reading these books written, these sort of ideological manuals written by people like Ciobanu and Espenia and these others, and they're trying to live up to those values. And so the legion that they're dying for in Pitești is not the legion that really existed in the 30s. And so they get arrested and they say, you're a legionary. And they say, no, I wasn't. And the Securitate says, yes, you were. And then we're going to torture you until you deny that you were, which is kind of ironic, but they do this again and again. And it really reaches its pinnacle in Aiud in 1964. So just before they do this general amnesty and let all the political prisoners go, they have a massive project. By this stage, they've started culling many of the political prisoners, and they've moved most of the legionaries, the people in prison for being a legionary, to this one prison in Aiud. And some of these people were too young to have experienced the real legion. And so what they remember, what their experience of legionaries in many ways is memory that they encountered in prison. So the first time they met old legionaries who had followed Condemnation, they met them in prison. And the problem of learning memory from people who were in prison is that people lie in prison, because everyone knows that the Securitate deliberately put informers into the cells to provoke conversations, and then they would punish you for saying the wrong thing in those conversations. And so people are passing on rumors that are not true. People are lying deliberately to their cellmates. And so some of these people know or don't know what was really going on. And this is why there's so much trouble with people like Petre Pandia's memoirs, because he tries to tell us what he knows about the Legion, but what he knew about it, he learned in prison. And so his information is not always that reliable. And what happens in 64 is the Securitate have this massive re-education project where they get all these legionaries together and they say, I want you to write a book, a history of the Legion, that tells the truth. And the truth is that Condemnation and most of his friends were completely insane. They'd been driven insane by syphilis because they slept with most of Romania at the time. They were charlatans. None of them were truly religious. They were all manipulating religion. They were extremely violent, and they were morally corrupt. They were stealing money constantly. And the details that they put in this book are basically turning the memory of what they thought the Legion was on its head. And so it's par excellence, a project of wiping out autobiographical memory and replacing it with a politically accepted cultural memory. The same thing happens with resistance movements. again, many of the people like Ogoriano in his resistance movement, these guys were kids. They joined the Legion in 1946 as an anti-communist movement, or 47, one of the two. And so they themselves never knew the original movement, but they meet some of the original guys in the mountains. And so that autobiographical memory is being passed on, but in many ways, the Securitate create the resistance by trying to wipe out that autobiographical memory. It's as these guys, they didn't say, in many cases, some of them did, but in many cases, they didn't say, I'm going to fight and destroy the Communist Party. I'm going to go to the mountains to do it. They said, oh no, the Communist Party is trying to kill me. I'm going to run away to the mountains so I don't die. And so by trying to kill these people, the Securitate actually creates the resistance as a product of traditional justice. You see this in the Anota group. These guys are students, but also Arsenescu. So Arsenescu, he's not a legionary. He hated the legionaries. He fought against them in the Rebellione of 1941. But once he gets to the mountains, he's like, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so unlike other people, he actually is willing to work with them. And therefore this changes the memory of what a legionary is and how that functions. And that gets reinscribed in new ways in the mountains as well. One of the things that Monica points out that I think is really interesting is why women? Why pick on these women? Because many of them had done absolutely nothing wrong. But what they did do wrong is they were carriers of autobiographical memory. They were the carriers, they knew exactly what had been going on. They'd been involved in these networks and they could go and tell others. And in order to make the transition effective to state socialism, the Communist Party really had to wipe out anyone who could authoritatively say what the past was like. It's interesting, just to finish up now, there's no real, there's huge differences. I've been arguing, hey, it's the same thing, but it's not. The final chapter on Corposo that Monica talks about and the way that was shaped, that shaped 1990s politics, there's nothing comparable in the 1940s or 50s. There really is democratic discussion going on in the 90s. And so one of the things that you get when you put down Monica's book and you're like, wow, all this horrible stuff's going on and there's so much that the truth is being rolled over, like steamrolled and ignored, but nothing compared to the 40s and 50s. So similar mechanisms are at play, but there is still a lot more diversity and dialogue and polyphony in the post-socialist period than there was in the transition to state socialism.
Roland, thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. And now I will hand over the word to Mihai Russo from the Lucian Blaga University in Romania and Sibiu. And Mihai will point out the methodological effort of Monica at deconstructing the binaries underpinning Romanian historical memory of the communist period. So, Mihai, please.
Thank you, Daria, and thank you, Monica, for inviting me to have this conversation focused on your book. When I first came across Monica's book and read its title, I thought, well, this is yet another book on the so-called obsessive decade of the 1950s that must be focused on prosecuting and sentencing an already prosecuted and sentenced communist past. Now, as I started actually reading the book, I had to admit that my presumptions were plainly wrong. Because despite this I would say, rather deceitful title, the book is nothing of this sort. On the contrary, I would argue that Monica departs quite significantly from the conventional framework of interpreting the communist past, and she constructs an analysis that, in my perspective, is impressive on at least two related aspects. First and foremost, the book is impressive because Monica systematically undermines and methodologically deconstructs the mnemonic dualities or the binaries that underpin the discourse on the communist past that was developed in post-communist Romania. And she shows, especially in the introduction of her book, how this discourse on Romanian communism was structured along two parallel discourses: the anti-communist perspective, which is opposable to the post-communist one, and each of them was driven by its own particular motivation and pursued quite different outcomes. And she shows how the anti-communist perspective was driven mainly by the moral urge of telling the truth about the past, but also of condemning it thoroughly, and by doing this, hoping to achieve justice by reckoning with the past and by settling the scores with the communist regime. The post-communist perspective, on the other hand, was driven by a rather political, practical reason, I would say, that of moving away from a difficult past, of trying to bury the collective past in collective oblivion, and to employ what Lavinia Stan has called a policy of forgive and forget, and of course of moving forward, leaving the past behind. Now, it is clear that each of these narratives produce simplistic and quite distorted representations on the communist past. The anti-communist narrative of national trauma conceived of the historical experience of state socialism as an entirely negative period that was governed by a criminal and illegitimate political regime, in which the line demarcating the victims from the perpetrators and the heroes from the villains is always straightforward and clear-cut. Now, Monica shows that this narrative reduces communism to its criminal dimension, and by doing so, it refuses to acknowledge that it was much more than just torture, trauma, and repression within a country transformed overnight into a permanent Gulag archipelago. On the other hand, the post-communist narrative tended to assess the former regime in positive, even nostalgic terms, and sometimes going to the extremes to even glorify the achievements of the Romanian nation during communism. Of course, this perspective is also limited and simplistic because it ignores the suffering of the victims of communism and totally disregards their claim for recognition, for remembering, and for repair. Now, Monica Ciobanu's book excels, I would argue, at undermining these structural dichotomies that are ingrained in how the discourse on Romanian communism developed. In each and every chapter of her book, Monica shows that it is nowhere possible to see things in a black and white perspective, and that there are always numerous shades of gray of various chromatic intensities. In my reading of the book, I believe that one chapter or two chapters stand out as outstanding, those dedicated to the victims and the heroes versus the perpetrators and the victims. And approaching this difficult topic, Monica Ciobanu casts serious doubt on the heroic status of some of the Romanians who fought in the armed resistance movement during the 1950s. And as Roland Clark previously mentioned, there were several types of fascist entanglements within this movement, which makes it difficult to render all these people uncritical as heroic only because they fought against a communist repressive regime. In the case of political prisoners, although some of them, as Monica emphasized, are now being pushed for sainthood, Monica shows the necessary reality of collusion, compromise, and concession that had to be made in order to survive during imprisonment and living in such harsh conditions. Now regarding the perpetrators, and I think that this is the part of the book that is really outstanding. Monica Ciobanu takes the difficult path of struggling to empathically understand and sociologically comprehend the factors that shaped the ruthless character and brutal behavior of these perpetrators. She looks, for instance, at the family origins of these people. She emphasizes the lack of education, their violent childhoods, that they were, most of them, victims of social exclusion, and that the communist regime provided them a platform in which they exercised a kind of political opportunism. The easy road that was taken by so many scholars is to demonize these prison guards, these Securitate agents, and these party members, and to treat them as the human personification of evil. This is the standard narrative that is consecrated in the scholarship. Now, what Monica does in her book is to humanize the angels, I would say, that is the prison saints, by showing their weaknesses and their moral compromises, but also, and this is more controversial, to humanize the devils of the communist regime, that is the prison guards, the torturers, and all these bad guys of communism. This is, of course, disturbing, and it is quite troubling, but it is also necessary for grasping the intricacies, the contradictions, the complexities, and the ambivalences of such a multifaceted reality, as was the case with Romanian communism. The second point that I believe needs to be mentioned is that Monica Ciobanu's book goes well beyond the transitional justice paradigm. Her approach breaks free of the normative straitjacket that constrain much of the research made on communist on Romanian communism and its memory. And in doing so, the book develops a genuine sociology of memory, and it develops an approach that is grounded in the works of Maurice Alvax, Jeffrey Olick, and all the other great sociologists that highlighted the fact that memory is always constructed, and it consists of representations of the past that are never objective reflections of reality. In conclusion, I would say that Monica Ciobanu's book poses difficult questions about a haunting past, and the answers she provides are just as disturbing as the questions themselves. And this is paradoxically the greatest merit of this work. As such, Ciobanu's monograph constitutes a morally uneasy reading that refuses the hasty gesture of condemning the past without comprehending its complex intricacies and moral ambiguities. It is at the same time a theoretically reflexive and analytically lucid approach that sets the ground for a contextualized understanding of a troubled and still troubling past. I would like to congratulate you for writing this book, and to confess that I would have loved to write such a powerful and disturbing book.
Thank you, Mihai, for your input. Joanna Wawrzyniak will provide the third comment. Joanna is from the Institute of Sociology in Warsaw University, and she will go beyond the Romanian case and will compare the politics of memory in post-1989 Romania and Poland. Joanna is our third and last discussant, but everybody is of course welcome to participate in the discussion by writing questions in the chat. And I would suggest that after the comment of Joanna, Monica will provide a long, detailed answer on all these three comments, and then we'll can proceed to the further questions. So Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Daria. And also thank you so much to Monica for inviting me, and thanks to your invitation for giving me a pleasure to read that book, because I would like to join Roland and Mihai in really praising the book, because it's a great read, and it really helps to understand Romania also to outsiders as myself. But it also helps to understand the broader issues, which is this nice view on the transitional justice from micro and macro scale. And this is what you do, just moving between these two dimensions, a shift from communicative to cultural memory. And also, and what is really kind of moving about that book, it really gives an account of the horrid stories of the mutual violence, but also about the ambiguity of the collective memory of that violence. And if I was to pick my favorite chapter of that book, that would be the one about the Pitești experiment, because I was not, I knew that it was there, but I've never read such a detailed account of that, and also from the memory perspective. So that was a really moving chapter. But but my task is not to speak about the book, but it is to bring, to draw your attention to some differences and similarities between Romanian and Polish case, because that's what Monica asked me to do that. And not to take too much time, I will try to do it in bullet points, mainly focusing on differences, but then drawing your attention to some of similarities. And I would like to divide that between the historic level and the memory level. So, well, on the history level, the difference is in the fact that it lies both in the World War II and in the communist period, but starting with World War II, Poland was not a Nazi ally, and that really makes a huge difference in that what's going on afterward. So of course there have been some pro-Nazi right-wing partisans, which Poles are not always willing to admit that yes they were there, but they were so marginal and not really seriously treated by the Nazis themselves that they were not really important for the, let's say, later history and the history of the commemoration. Although, of course, the Polish communists used made an argument the accused of collaboration with fascism, the Home Army, which was not, which was fighting against the Germany, but still that argument that they were fascists was being made, but in a very short period. So what is also, very what's the difference between the Romanian and Polish case? That the most severe repression in the Romanian case, and that's the chronology of Monica's book, takes between 1944 and 1964, and that's the period which then after '89 becomes, the main field of the commemoration. For Poland, it is the beginning of the beginning of the war, so the first 2 years. So that's first of all the murder of the Polish officers in the Katyn, which become one kind of the main and the iconic Stalinist crime, but also the deportation of Poles and the Polish Jews from the Western Ukraine to the Soviet Union. But still, they are very ambiguous. Some people, of course, died on the way, but some, especially Polish Jews, were safe thanks to those deportations. So there is also this ambiguity of this war story, which there is less ambiguities in the Romanian case. And then the real moment of the repression, which takes, the other moment of the repression, which takes place in Poland, it takes place between 1949 and 1953, let's say up to 1955, 56, and this is the persecution of the Home Army members, but they come to the end in 1955. Something like this. So, well, there are the stories that the last prisoner was released in the mid-60s, but it was, one person or two. But most of them were actually released in the 50, 55, 56. And the scale of the persecution was just much, much smaller. And what happened in Poland since 1968, it's the new generation which starts to be active as a dissident movement. So you have the intelligentsia dissident movement, the post-1968, and then the workers' movement and the solidarity. So you already have, the second generation, of the anti-communist generation and under communism. And finally, the way out, of course, is different because we do have, the round table is a different way out of the regimes and the Ceausescu. The killing of Ceausescu. So that, the Second World War and the communist period just created different agencies, right? Which were on play in the post-1989 period. But here, still we can speak about what happens, and this is where I go to transfer to this mnemonic level. Here we can still speak about some similarities. So there are, what I really like in your book, Monica, is just, it's going to the civil society, and that's what also you call the militant civil society. So there are in Poland, the associations of the Katyn families, the families of the soldiers who were killed, the officers who were killed in Katyn, Sybiracy, who were the families of those who were expelled deported to the deep in the Soviet Union, of the of the people who were imprisoned in the 50s and so on. So there are different associations, and also you can draw some similarities between the Iron God, the narratives around Iron God, and the so-called cursed soldiers, which is a new symbolist right now invented by the Polish right wing, which tries to put into that cursed soldiers narrative the Home Army and some other more right wing partisans of the Second World War. And so the kind of the ambiguities between condemnation of the communist violation of human rights and the very unreflective commemoration of far right behavior during the war in the immediate post-war, are quite the same, I think, in both of these cases. But what happens in Poland, and that what is different, are the mainstream debates, because the mainstreams are basically about the round table, and the round table, and which gave a very contested legacy, because many actors, the political actors, claimed that the round table was more or less the betrayal, or what happened later on was the betrayal of the agreement, or the very round table was a betrayal of the solidarity movement. But that has been the round table, and most of the debates, in the last 30 years were the post solidarity struggle. So that was the struggle between the agents, and the actors who were involved in the solidarity movement, and not so much, in all this Stalinist, the victims of the Stalinist repression. And now just the very final point, because what you claim is that, this identity, and very often the ethnocentric politics of identity, has very much to do with the dealings of the Stalinist repression. So again, it is, kind of the same in the Polish case, because you do have the politics of, the ethnocentrism and the identity politics. But here, what really plays the role is, and in this case, these are not neither the memories of the Stalinist repression, nor, or perhaps to some extent, the solidarity movement, but not that much, but the memories of the Second World War, but the Nazi occupation. And most of the biggest debate, and the historians' debate, but also the public was involved in that, were related to the memories of the involvement of the Poles in the Holocaust, and the extent they were involved, the extent they were innocent. Of course, you do have the same debates, like in Romania, and similar debates in the Jashi case and others, but still, the scope, I think, of the debate was bigger and more important in Poland. Also the Polish-German relation, especially in the reconciliations, because especially the 1/3 of the Polish post-war state is based on the post-German territories, and the Ukrainian relations, to say the last. So those setting the scores of the Second World War was, in my opinion, at least that important, or perhaps it even overshadowed the setting the scores of the communist repression, or at least you need to look at both of them to really understand the field of the politics of the memory after the 1989. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Joanna. And I think it would make sense if Monika Ciobanu would just answer on this. We'll provide a comment on these 3 comments. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Daria, for taking this role. I know it was not planned. Thanks to the 3 discussants. Thank you for being so insightful and also so supportive of my work. And I will try to make some comments on your comments. So first, Roland, I really appreciate your point about how actually the memory of the repression, especially among the legionaries, was based on more or less partially acquired legionary identity that occurred during imprisonment and the memory of what legionarism was about, right? I would also add to that other political prisoners who joined the Gulag later, the younger ones in the 1950s, that those political prisoners, the older ones, also had a great impact on their beliefs, on the way in which they learned and they transmitted the message of the Iron Guard movement after 1989. So I'm thinking about, I mean, many memoirs talk about how the young prisoners have been taken under the wing of the older prisoners, some of them who were part of the legionary movement, although this is also not quite clear whether they were really part of the legionary movement or sympathizers. And how, because these older prisoners knew how to cope with prison life, helped these younger ones overcome the trauma of the prison, but also converted them to strong Christian Orthodox beliefs, right? So it is interesting how this imagined identity gets transmitted and disseminated after 1989. And I have in mind the case of the former head of the Association of Political Prisoners, Octavian Bjoza, who was recently dismissed from his post because for some contentious, controversial, inappropriate comments that he made about the prison saints movements and the former legionaries. He was not enrolled in any political party when he was imprisoned, but he learned about legionarism, and he claims that he was protected and very much helped in surviving the prison because of the members of the Iron Guard movement. So this is where his sympathy toward these political prisoners came from, which of course became controversial in the current context of memory politics in Romania. I also appreciate that both you and Mihai made comments about the members of the armed resistance, right? And I'm also thinking about this in relationship to a broader problem, not problem, but I would say difficult, one of the difficult aspects of writing this book, but fascinating at the same time, was how to disentangle fiction from reality. And it's not just the fiction constructed by the victims. It's also the fiction constructed by Securitate and the files. In many instances, Securitate invented these anti-communist groups, which were not anti-communist or necessarily very political, as you, Roland, mentioned, right? These were ordinary people, or like the women who were put in extraordinary situations, who were reacting to something that was just going against their lifestyle, their beliefs, and things that they were accustomed to. The armed resistance was not only exaggerated after 1989, but during the 1950s and the 1960s by the official authorities themselves. So if you had like 3 people, high school students or university students, who were listening to Radio Free Europe or who were talking about the partisans in the mountains, that automatically they were becoming a resistance movement, and a trial was conducted against them, right? So I think this is a very good point. Mihai, I really regret now when I was listening to your comment that the title of my book was misleading. But I'm also very pleased to hear that when you read the book, you were actually well surprised and appreciated the different angle that my work took on this particular period of the Romanian communist history and the interpretation of this history. And it makes me also wonder about the reactions that I received, you know, about this book. And it seems to me that as far as Romanian-based scholars, that my book generated more interest and more positive responses from people in your generation, you and Simona Mitroiu, and I would say much cooler reactions from people in my generation and some maybe angry reactions from the older generation. So I kind of understand better when I was listening to you how my work has been received in different ways by different scholars who work in Romania, and on this Romanian history. And to clarify a few things about the perpetrators, because I know this was something that probably made you really a little bit shocked and surprised. I want to make it clear that empathizing is different from approving or endorsing, right? And one of the things that perhaps was not enough emphasized in my talk is that a lot of this history has been interpreted from a religious angle. And it is very common in the aftermath of human rights violations and mass atrocities to employ both religious language and religious symbolism. And I think this, Joanna can confirm that this is happening a lot in Poland, also in Russia and other countries in the former Yugoslavia. And this is very problematic in itself when you label those who were on the right side of the history as angels, and you demonize and call villains those who were engaged in the repression. Why? Because I think this is an obstacle in understanding what really happened, and also in actually not making the perpetrators accountable when you dehumanize them, right? Accountable for their deeds. So they were just evil people, or Corneliu Coposu in his memoir and other memoirs talked about the prison guards in Râmnicu Sărat prison and other detention facilities as looking strange people who didn't look like us Romanians, who looked Asian, who were not speaking our language, who were not Christian. So in other words, Romanians cannot be villains, cannot commit abuses, but only other people against Romanians, right? And I also think, and this is something that I began to realize when I was listening to your comments, Mihai, that the biographies of the lower echelons of the so-called perpetrator groups, the prison guards, they also help dismantle the myth of the interwar society and political system as a perfect type of society and system where everyone was happy, everyone had the same kinds of opportunities. I mean, speaking by using some language that it became very fashionable today, that it was a real social justice type of society, the interwar period, right? And in fact, it was not such a beautiful scene. There were extremists, there were acts of violence, there were many injustices. Political parties were not so harmonious. The leaders were not so noble or honest, all of them, right? So it's important that in relationship to these perpetrators, we also understand better the interwar period and we dismantle one of the prevailing myths of the interwar Romania. Thank you. I'm both of you had very supportive comments of my work. Thank you, Joanna, also for your supportive comments. I think your comments also push me further to understand and realize that we need more comparative studies in the area of memory politics. We have enough work that deals with case studies, and it is really difficult to engage in comparison when you are not fluent in various East European languages. But I hope that now we started a collaboration, so we will continue this collaboration, the two of us. I also paid attention to your point about cutting, right? And I assume, and I know that cutting, I wonder if we can think about in broader, more comparative terms of real historical traumas that have been interpreted as defining the Ukrainian, the Romanian, the Polish identity. So I'm thinking about Pitești, I'm thinking about cutting, maybe Holodomor in the Ukrainian case. So that might be also an interesting line of analysis to pursue. But it's also very important that you made this historical distinctions between Poland and Romania and the context of World War II, how World War II was different, and the relationships with Nazi Germany was different in Romania than in Poland, and how conveniently it is to actually emphasize only those histories that relate to occupation and repression, and minimize or dismiss those historical periods that deal with collaboration with an occupying force or with a bad actor like the Nazis, right? Instead of focusing on the remembrance or on the historical facts of, those actions that may put a negative kind of label on the nation of the people of Moldova, or Romania or Poland or Ukraine. So, and one comment about the methodology, because it seems Roland Clark emphasized my transitional justice approach, Mihai-Stelian Rusu emphasized my sociology of memory approach. But I think Joanna kind of said it in a way in which I would like to think that my work is situated between the macro and the micro level analysis of historical remembering. And I think there is more consensus among scholars who study the past, right? Whether they are social scientists, political scientists, historians, also people from humanities and interdisciplinary scholars. And I'm glad that I see here in the audience, maybe they left now, Jill Massino and Valentina Glajar, that these two, I think that the line between these two areas of study is becoming more blurred, because more and more scholars understand that the distant past can also be subject of very intense debates about historical redress. And we see more, I think, current debates in the area of historical accountability and historical justice, right? So I would like to think that I was able to merge these two different approaches and to kind of overcome these disciplinary boundaries between political science on the one hand and sociologists and historians on the other hand. And I realized that some scholars in one of the other areas may not like this way of analyzing the past, because unfortunately scholars, academics tend to be very parochial, very territorial, right, about their areas, about their disciplines. But I think we can no longer avoid this kind of cross-disciplinary perspective and the dialogue between different disciplines. So any other questions? I'm not sure I responded very well to the 3 comments. I see somebody, I don't know, Alexander Peter Popescu. Do you have any questions? I don't know your work or.
Thank you very much. I'm not that important. I am just a listener. Well, I'm dealing as well with the Iron Guard. I know Roland from I think we met we met in New Zealand or in Australia, in Sydney, in 2010, 2011, that time. Well, I'm dealing with the Iron Guard in relationship to the Romanians, and so Romanian fascism, Iron Guard, and the resistance. And now I'm, well, searching for a doctor father, for a mentor in order to go on with my thesis. And it was a quite interesting topic because Corneliu Coposu is, well, the uncle of my stepfather, so he's in my family, and that's why I was very familiar with what you said. Just one comment. I think that the guardians in the, well, in the penitentiaries where Corneliu Coposu suffered were not all Romanians, so there were a lot of minorities there, and that's why I think that Corneliu Coposu wanted to stress out and to emphasize that there were not, it's not the Romanian nature to do that. Of course, it's a kind of idealizing and identity alterity and so on. Imagology, I know that it is worth to criticize that, but I don't think that he wanted to point out that the atrocities done by his torturers, well, as a Christian, you cannot think another way. So he was very Christian, and he believed in God, and that's why he couldn't get out of this dualism and polarity between good and evil. So he has to dehumanize in some way the evil. So for a Christian believer, it is almost impossible to stress out the humanity of the human being. So because of course Hannah Arendt did the same way. So Hannah Arendt about Eichmann, I think she wanted to tell the same like you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope I didn't take you by surprise or put you on the spot. I just wanted to make sure, because Roland and Mihai and Joanna, we meet quite often at conferences. We are part of the same network, so I didn't want to continue this conversation among the usual suspects. I wanted to hear different reactions and different voices. Actually, in my chapter on the National Peasant Party and Coposu, I have many laudatory things to say about Corneliu Coposu. Yes, I mean, my work on the perpetrators has been informed, theoretically informed by Hannah Arendt, but not so much by her, but somebody who further developed her framework. The French-Bulgarian political philosopher, Tzvetan Todorov, who who made a comparison about the perpetrators of the Nazi regime and of the Soviet Gulag. So, so thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you, everybody, for participating, answering, commenting, responding. So our next online seminar will take place on March 28th, on Monday. Today we'll talk about Romania. Next time we will talk about Hungary. And you can find further details on the website of our working group or on our Facebook page. And we have one more seminar planned in April, on 4th April. Exactly, you should take a look on our calendar of PoSoCoMeS. Then thank you very much. Have a good evening. Have a good and peaceful week.